Okay, welcome back, everyone. Thank you so much for joining me today. So the next session that we're going to talk about, and I'm going to share my screen here really quickly, is session 5. And session 5 is about cholesterol. As I mentioned before, we always start our sessions by reading a quote and asking our community members what this quote means to me, or what it means to them. And so this quote is from Ella Fitzgerald, a famous singer in the African American community. And she says, just don't give up what you're trying to do. Where there is love and inspiration, I don't think you can go wrong. So, what that would probably mean to me is that it's often hard to try to live a healthy lifestyle, but where we can find love and inspiration, that can help us to motivate us to keep moving forward. And usually we look for those around us, our loved ones, our spouses and our family members, our children in some cases, or our parents. We can look to them for that love and inspiration, and they can help us to sometimes push forward even when it's hard to live a healthy lifestyle. And so today we're going to talk about cholesterol and having high cholesterol and what that can do to your heart health. But as we talk about the session and the different actions that we should do to live a healthier lifestyle, including reducing the amount of saturated fats in our foods, we talked previously about salt and sodium in our foods and what to do to reduce that. But we want to think about ways to stay inspired to keep moving forward. And that's where sometimes we have to think about the other love and inspiration in our lives that can help us to address our need. Now, I'm going to mainly use the slides today. Again, I want you to make sure that you're using your manual and that you're teaching from your manual so that you can help individuals to understand. Okay, so in your manuals, if you were to go to page 5.3 in your manual, you will see this about an activity, what you should do before you do the session on cholesterol. Now, I did do some of this in person, and this is a guess the fat activity that I want you to try to do with your community members when you're in person. Now, the way you would do this is back that you can buy some lard, some shortening or some lard, and then paper plates, and then at least 3 of the food items that are going to be listed in the chart I'm going to show you in just a minute. And I want you to write the name of each food item on the plates, the separate plates, and then put the amount of fat that you'll see. So when I was there, I can't remember if I actually did the food items, but I put a serving. So you can see here in the tablespoons. We want you to buy measuring spoons ahead of time, buy lard if possible, and then buy colored paper plates. Now, it's important that the paper plates you buy are colored in red or blue or something. If it's white paper plates, then it's hard to see the lard sample on a white paper plate. So try to buy a colored paper plate. And then we want you to buy these food items. So 2 ounces of cheese. If you have the 2 ounces of American cheese, then you can put that with 3.5 tablespoons of the lard. Just scoop out 3.5 and a quarter, I meant to say, tablespoons, and put that on the plate with the American cheese. For a regular, like this is tablespoon of mayonnaise, you can actually use, so if you go like to restaurants and they have those mayonnaise in those tubes, that's about 2 tablespoons. So if you have that, you can use that. And that's going to be like 5.25 teaspoons. And I'm sorry, I meant to say teaspoons earlier. 5.25 teaspoons of that lard. So you would put 5 dollops and then a little quarter teaspoons of the lard. You can do 2 pieces of chicken, a wing and a thigh, or and then that's going to be 9.5 of those teaspoons of lard. One beef hot dog has 4¼ teaspoons of lard. One can of cooked beans, you're only then talking about a quarter. Orange, so if you bring a piece of fruit, orange, you can use an apple as well if that's what you have. It's going to have none. But I encourage you to do this demonstration before you get like prepare this demonstration so that you can really show your community members about this. So the name of this is session 5, keep your cholesterol in check. And we've already talked about Miss Ella Fitzgerald and what she said about inspiration. So today we're going to talk about cholesterol in your blood and what it has to do with heart disease. Now, one of the other things that you can do, and I'm here at my desk, so I can do this now, is I got a toilet paper roll. I don't know if you can see now, but you can see there. And then you can also get some felt or some red construction paper. And if you put the red construction paper around the toilet paper, then you can make a heart, right? I'm sorry, not a heart, a blood vessel. So let's say that this is our blood vessel, and you can see where I made it, this blood vessel out of toilet paper, and you can use red construction paper. I had red felt, so I used the red felt, and then you can make your little diagram heart. And I have here a little thing like a red blood cell. And if I take the red blood cell, I can see that I can pass it through very easily through my diagram of the artery, right? This is my artery. This is my red blood cell. And this red blood cell is just a piece of clay that red clay that I made into a little donut-shaped red blood cell, right? So you can see that. And we can make this diagram and we can see that, hey, I can easily put the red blood cell, and I know you can't see it now, but I can easily drop it through my tube, which is the artery. But in situations where you have high cholesterol, what happens, and so I got another piece of clay here, and the cholesterol is going to build up in the walls of the artery. So you can see where in my little diagram here, I can make the walls clot or blocked with this clay. I have yellow clay here, and I'm sorry you can't see it as well. That I'm putting into my artery. And so that's what happens in our body when we have high cholesterol, is that the cholesterol is going to stick to the walls of our arteries. So what does this now mean? So this now means that if I try to put my red blood cell through now, well, now it's going to get stuck, right? It's not going to be able to flow through that artery. And so this is just a diagram that you can make that's what it looks like, using the felt or red construction paper, a roll of toilet paper that you've used, and then you can use clay, red clay, and here I have yellow clay. So that's a diagram just of that, and I encourage you to consider making that. So today we're going to talk about the cholesterol in your blood and what it has to do with heart disease. You'll learn what you can do to keep your cholesterol levels in the healthy range. We'll also do group activities that show how much saturated fat is in some of the foods that we eat and how to cook with less saturated fat. So on this slide, you can see the diagram of a normal heart. But what happens is that eventually, like as we eat more saturated fat, and we're going to learn in just a few minutes about LDL cholesterol and HDL cholesterol and the different types of cholesterol and fat. But what happens is we'll get a plaque that starts developing in our arteries from that those cholesterol. And over time, that plaque can get larger and can start blocking our blood flow, just like I had shown with this diagram. And I know it's hard to see, but you can see where the cholesterol is starting to build up in my arteries here. And then that's going to eventually start to block that artery. Now, what also happens is that as blood is flowing through that artery, and it's being closed off, some of that plaque can get torn away. And when that plaque is torn away, then you can get clot formation. And it's that clot formation that can really then occlude that blood vessel. And so we're going to talk about more about that shortly. But the key point here is that eating a lot of saturated fats or eating and having high cholesterol can lead to blockages happening in our blood vessels. So high cholesterol in African Americans. So the facts don't lie. If you have unhealthy levels of cholesterol in your blood, you're more likely to get heart disease, including a heart attack or a stroke. About 1/4 or 24% of African Americans have high cholesterol. Now, this is going to be one area, though, that you're going to see kind of the numbers are better for African Americans than for other groups, right? About 1/4 or 24% of African Americans have high cholesterol. That's compared to 27% of adults in other ethnic groups. So that means that this is the one area that African Americans tend to have lower levels of cholesterol. But we still need to make sure that we're vigilant and we're watching the amount of saturated fat that we have, and that we're also checking our cholesterol levels. Because the bad news is that about half or 55% of all adults with high cholesterol in the United States take a drug to treat that cholesterol, but only 44% of African Americans do. So while we don't suffer as much from high cholesterol, unfortunately, we also don't have that high cholesterol treated as often as other groups. So we need to educate our community members about the risk factors of high cholesterol, and then make sure that they're getting the treatments if they need treatment for it. So what is cholesterol then? The cholesterol in your body is a soft, waxy, fat-like substance. Your body needs cholesterol in order to make hormones or vitamin D or other substances like that, and then to help with digestion. So we do need cholesterol, but our body makes all of the cholesterol that we need, right? So we will get all of the cholesterol that we need because our body can produce all of the cholesterol that we need. So as I mentioned, though, so cholesterol in your body is a soft, waxy-like substance, and I use this in my demonstration. I use Play-Doh. You can buy plasticine or other things, but it's going to be a soft, waxy-like substance that can build up in the arteries, in our arteries, and then cause blockages, right? Small packages called lipoproteins carry cholesterol throughout our bloodstream. There are two types of lipoproteins that carry the cholesterol. One is LDL. We're going to talk about it more in a minute. LDL is the low density lipoprotein. It's lousy. We want to keep it low, right? The other one is HDL, or high density lipoprotein. And the HDL is helpful. And so we want to make sure that we're keeping our HDL high. So remember, LDL, low density lipoprotein, it's lousy. We want to keep it low. HDL is a healthier lipoprotein, high density lipoprotein, and we want to try to keep that high. So LDL and HDL cholesterol, as I mentioned earlier, LDL, or low density lipoprotein, it actually deposits the cholesterol inside your arteries that are carrying your blood to your heart and to other parts of the body. So that LDL is going to be the one that's kind of responsible for developing those plaques inside of our arteries, our LDL. Over time, cholesterol, along with other substances, can form that plaque inside of your arteries and can prevent blood flow. And then, as I had mentioned earlier, so you get this plaque formation, and then if the top of this plaque is like sheared off for any reason, or it tears off, then you can start having clot formation. And then it's that clot that is going to actually then just block off this blood flow and lead to the heart attack. So LDL, we want to make sure that we're keeping our LDL lower, because that's going to be what's causing this plaque formation. Our HDL, or high density lipoprotein, it actually helps our body by getting rid of some of the cholesterol. And so it doesn't build that plaque in our arteries like the LDL does. So we want to keep in mind Low density lipoprotein, it's lousy, keep that down. High density lipoprotein, it's healthy. We want to keep that higher. The goal for LDL cholesterol is different for everyone. So it's going to depend on your particular situation about where you want to keep your LDL cholesterol levels. If you have comorbidities, and when I say comorbidities, I mean other heart disease risk factors, such as diabetes or high blood pressure, then there is reasons that you probably want to keep your LDL even lower than what we talk about. And so you're going to want to talk to your doctor about the importance, particularly if you have high blood pressure or diabetes, of keeping your LDL lower. But it's going to be different for everyone. The number of risk factors that you have, such as high blood pressure or a history of low HDL, family history of heart disease, your age, your gender, these are all factors that can affect where you want to keep your LDL levels. So you want to look at your individual situation and say, hey, do I have high blood pressure? If I do, I want to make sure that I'm being extra vigilant about keeping my LDL low. Do I have a family history of heart disease? How old am I? An older individual? These are all going to be reasons to keep your LDL lower. The higher your LDL levels and the more risk factors you have, the greater your chance of developing heart disease or having a heart attack. Your healthcare provider can help you set the goals for your LDL level. Triglyceride is another type of fat that we can learn about. So we've talked about LDL cholesterol. That's the lousy cholesterol. We want to keep that low. We talked about the HDL cholesterol, the high density lipoprotein. It's the good cholesterol. We want to try to keep that high. But another one that we were talking about is triglycerides. And that's another type of fat in your blood that can increase your risk of heart disease. Certain health problems and medications can increase your triglyceride levels. So it's important if you're on certain medications that can have an impact on triglycerides that you stay aware that, hey, I might need to keep my triglyceride levels lower. But eating too many calories and foods that are high in fat and sugar, drinking too much alcohol, and smoking can also cause your body to make more triglycerides, right? So we want to make sure that we're avoiding these types of activities. A fasting triglyceride level of 150 milligrams per deciliter is high. Normal is less than 75, and that's where we want to keep our triglyceride levels. Now, going back to cholesterol. So we've talked about triglycerides. I'm going to now go back to cholesterol. And so where do we want to keep those numbers? So for total cholesterol, what is desirable is less than 200 milligrams per deciliter for our total cholesterol. If that's where we are, then that's good. We want to keep it there. Or for our total cholesterol, if it's between 200 to 239, that's borderline high. And so depending on your other risk factors, you may be at risk of heart disease. So it's time that we look at ways to lower our total cholesterol, including physical activity and losing weight if we're overweight. We want to be able to talk to our doctor about these things. And then for 240 milligrams per deciliter of total cholesterol or higher, well, that's pretty high. And then that puts us at more risk of developing heart disease and having a heart attack. So we want to really talk to our doctor about those steps that we can take. Now, on this chart here, we're looking at our total cholesterol, our HDL cholesterol, and our triglyceride levels. And so with our LDL, remember that LDL, the low density lipoprotein, it's the lousy cholesterol. We want to keep that down. We want to have our LDL cholesterol less than 100 milligrams per deciliter. And if you have other risk factors, as we mentioned, high blood pressure, diabetes, and other risk factors, then you really want to make sure that you're talking to your doctor and keeping it down. But for our LDL, we want to keep it less than 100. 100 to 129 is near desirable, but it's still kind of getting elevated. Borderline high for LDL would be 130 to 159. And then if we're at 160 for our LDL cholesterol, that's very high, and we're at an increased risk. So all of these things that we're talking about are risk factors. They're risk factors for heart disease, risk factors for having a heart attack or a stroke. And so our LDL, we want to make sure we bring it down and take those steps to bring it down if it's greater than 160. For our HDL, remember, that's the healthy cholesterol. We want to keep that higher. The higher we can get our HDL, the better. Usually we want to keep it above 40 milligrams per deciliter. If you have some of these other risk factors, chances are your HDL is going to be down, right? You want to find ways to make sure you're doing those things to get your HDL up. And you can talk to your doctor about those things, but those are going to include things like physical activity, eating less saturated fats, lowering your blood pressure if you have high blood pressure. Those are steps that you can take to make sure that your HDL will go up. And then we talked about triglycerides. We want to keep our triglycerides below 150 milligrams per deciliter. So risk of high triglyceride levels and how to stay healthy. People with high triglycerides often have low HDL. So they usually run different. As I was saying, that if you have high triglyceride levels, that can affect your HDL. And when you have high triglyceride, that may lower your HDL. People with diabetes can also have high triglycerides and low HDL cholesterol. So that's another situation. If you have diabetes, that may affect not only your triglycerides, so it's not only affecting your blood sugar, and we're going to go over that in a later session, but it's also affecting your HDL levels as well as your triglyceride levels if you have diabetes. So we want to make sure that we're looking at those steps to making sure that we're controlling our cholesterol. Here's what helps us to control our triglycerides at a healthy level: maintaining a healthy weight. And we talked about how we do that. We do that by getting regular physical activity. If you're an adult, you want to aim for 2 hours and 30 minutes a week or 30 minutes a day of physical activity. As we said, children need more. Children need at least 1 full hour every day of physical activity. We want to try to eat a heart-healthy diet, which includes eating low saturated fats. We want to limit our sugar, such as candy and other sweets. I know it's tempting, particularly this time of year, we're approaching Halloween, to have those little candies on the sides, go into our kids' packs and eat those Snicker bars and so forth. But we want to make sure that we're limiting the amount of sugar that we're getting from sweets and candies, from regular sodas. Coca-Cola, that Coke can have a lot of sugar in it. And so we want to make sure that we're reading our food labels and avoiding those foods that are high in sugar. We also want to make sure that we don't smoke. If you do smoke, that's one area that you need to quit, right? I know with alcohol consumption, well, hey, we don't want you to drink too much. We went over in the last session that men should only have 1 serving of alcohol a day. 2 servings of alcohol a day at the most. Women should only have 1. But smoking is something that if you smoke, you need to stop it as soon as possible. And then we want to limit our alcohol intake, as I mentioned. Now, there is another thing I wanted to talk about real quickly. Now, this is not in your manual, but I want you to cover it with your community members. And that's something that's called lipoprotein little a, or LP little a. Lipoprotein little a, or LP little a. So lipoprotein little a, LP little a, is a protein that transports cholesterol in the blood. High levels of lipoprotein little a in the blood can increase the likelihood of plaques forming or developing blood clots. So research shows that LP little a can cause LDL cholesterol to form those plaques on our blood vessel wall, leading to the narrowing and blocking of blood vessels and the hardening of arteries, which increases the risk of heart disease and stroke. A doctor can carry out a blood test to check a person's LP little a level if they suspect that they may have high LP little a levels. And if you have high LP little a levels, it's very important that you talk to your doctor. It's particularly important that you keep your LDL cholesterol low so that you avoid the risk factor of developing those clots or plaques in your arteries. As I said, LP little a, or lipoprotein little a, in heart disease LP little a can increase your risk of cardiovascular disease. Taking steps to control your cholesterol levels can help you to reduce these risk factors. And we've talked about those strategies for controlling your cholesterol: eating less saturated fats, getting exercise, that physical activity, at least 30 minutes a day, and then don't smoke. If you do smoke, stop, and then limiting your alcohol intake. Those are all things that you can do to help control your cholesterol levels. High LP(a) levels are those measuring greater than 50 milligrams per deciliter. Okay, so there are also genetic factors that can determine whether a person has high LP(a) levels. However, there's some evidence that diet and lifestyle change may also affect your LP(a) level. So with LDL cholesterol, with triglycerides, and now with this LP(a), we can see that lifestyle modifications, changing our diet to reduce the amount of salt that we, the amount of saturated fats that we get in our foods, controlling those risk factors such as high blood pressure by reducing the amount of salts. All of these lifestyle changes can help in many ways, including to help lower LP(a). But we need to also work with our doctors to determine how we go about addressing these issues. In some cases, low estrogen levels may cause LP(a) levels to increase. A doctor may test people going through menopause to check for a risk of cardiovascular disease. Some health conditions may cause high LP(a) levels. These can include hypothyroidism or underactive thyroid, uncontrolled diabetes. Again, looking at diabetes, and now we saw that, hey, it can increase our triglyceride levels, it can lower our HDL levels, and now it can also have an impact on our LP(a) levels. Kidney disease and nephrotic syndrome, which is a kidney disorder. Now, looking back at your risk factors for LDL cholesterol. So what affects your LDL cholesterol levels, or what are some of those things? So as we mentioned before, there are going to be some risk factors that we can't control, right? Age is going to be one of them. I can't control that I'm 53 years old now, right? So I'm older. I wish I can go back and be in my 20s, but I cannot do that. So age is a risk factor that can't be controlled. My genes. So if my grandparents, if my parents, if my brothers and sisters, others in my family have high cholesterol levels, then there's a high likelihood that I'm going to have high cholesterol levels as well. So that's another risk factor that I can't control, my family history or my genes, right? But there are some risk factors that we can control. And we can see here that our diet, we can control how much saturated fat we're getting, and eating a lot of saturated fat can increase our LDL levels. We can see that not getting enough physical activity can cause our LDL levels to go up. So we want to be more physically active, and that can help us to control our LDL levels. Smoking is a double whammy. Smoking not only lowers your HDL, which we said is the healthy cholesterol, it also increases your LDL. So smoking is going to do two things to us. It's going to lower our HDL while at the same time raising our HDL, and that's going to put us at greater risk of cardiovascular disease. And then being overweight, if we just lost a little bit of weight, then we can bring down our LDL levels. Having constant stress. Now, I know some of you may debate with me that, hey, that's something that we can't control. But the reality is that we can control our stress levels. We have to figure out how to bring that stress down, whether that's getting out and taking a walk and or joining a club and being more physically active, just relaxing, finding ways to cope. It might even include seeing a therapist or mental health advisor about how to reduce the amount of stress in our lives. So even though we might not think, even though we might think that we can't control stress, the reality of it is that we can, and we have to find a way to control our stress in order to make sure that we're bringing our LDL levels down, and we're helping to increase our HDL levels. Now, measuring your cholesterol levels. When you measure your cholesterol levels, you're going to do what's called a lipid profile test, right? If you make healthy lifestyle changes and your cholesterol levels are still too high, you can check your cholesterol levels by doing a lipid profile test. That can be done at your doctor, and that test is going to give you your total cholesterol, your LDL cholesterol, your HDL cholesterol, and your triglyceride levels. You can get that done at your doctor's office, and then that's going to tell you what your levels are. If your LDL is high, your doctor is going to probably talk to you about taking a medication to lower your LDL cholesterol levels. So if you have high LDL, you may need to start taking medications for it. And then you will have to talk to your doctor about that. But also those lifestyle changes, you can continue to do those as well. But you can get a test, a blood test, to measure your cholesterol levels, as I just mentioned, at your clinic or your healthcare provider's office. Or sometimes there's also screenings that are done at like health fairs or in other settings. And we'll talk about those in just a minute. The blood test that's done at your doctor's office, as I just mentioned, is called a lipid profile. It tells you the level of each of the types of fat that's in your blood, including your total cholesterol, your LDL cholesterol, your HDL cholesterol, and your triglyceride. We'll talk more about triglycerides later. Ask your doctor how to prepare for the test, because if the doctor's going to do this lipid profile test, well, you probably are going to have to fast. And fast means that, hey, you're not going to eat for the 4 to 8 hours before the test, because if you eat pizza, that's going to raise your cholesterol level in the short term, because that food is going to digest. It's going to dump the cholesterol into your blood until your body can like reabsorb it. It goes to where it needs to be. So your doctor, if you're going to do a cholesterol test, the lipid profile, your doctor may advise you that you need to fast before the test can be done. But you might also be in a situation where you're at a health fair and they say, hey, we'll check your cholesterol. Well, of course, that's not going to be fasting, right? You're probably just eating a cheese dog, drinking yourself a Coke, walking around, and now you didn't have time to fast. You probably weren't aware that, hey, I'm going to be here to get screened today. So you had your cup of coffee. And if you're like me, you add cream to that coffee. So this is a non-fasting lipid profile or a cholesterol check that's done at health fairs. Because it's non-fasting, it's a screening test. It's going to give you a measure, but it's important that you follow up with your doctor, particularly if that measure is abnormal. So what are the numbers? And we went over this already. For our total cholesterol, we want to be less than 200 milligrams per deciliter for our total cholesterol. We want our total cholesterol less than 200 milligrams per deciliter. That's what's desirable, good for you. If it's between 200 and 239, that's borderline high. So we need to then start thinking about, or not start thinking about, we need to talk to our doctors and making sure that we're taking action. And if your total cholesterol is above 240 milligrams per deciliter, if it's 240 or higher, that's when you really need to talk to your doctor, because you're at risk for developing heart disease and having a heart attack. And so we need to really make sure that we're communicating with our doctors. If your LDL cholesterol is 100 milligrams per deciliter or lower, then that's good. That's what we want to keep our LDL cholesterol at 100, less than 100 milligrams per deciliter is where we want our LDL cholesterol. If it's between 100 and 129, that's near desirable, but depending on your specific situation, like if you have high blood pressure or if you have diabetes or if you have other risk factors, then you may need to say, hey, that's near desirable, but no, I need to keep it lower because I have diabetes or I have these other risk factors. So everyone's situation is going to be different, but we want to keep it less than 100 if possible. We want to make sure that we're talking to our doctor, particularly if we have those other risk factors. If your LDL cholesterol is above 100, that's, even though you're near desirable, that's not desirable. So we want to make sure we're taking those actions to lower our LDL cholesterol. Between 130 and 159 is borderline high. And if your LDL cholesterol is greater than 160, then that's very high and you're at risk of developing those plaques in your arteries, of having a heart attack, and of having other health problems. Our HDL cholesterol, that's the healthy cholesterol. We want to kind of keep that high. We want to make sure that we're keeping that above 40 milligrams per deciliter. And then, as we had mentioned previously, with our triglyceride levels, we want to make sure that we're keeping our triglyceride levels greater than 150 milligrams per deciliter. So let's talk about the metabolic syndrome. And this is in your manual. And as I was mentioning earlier, if you have more than one risk factor, then that can put you in a particularly dangerous situation. And one of those situations that I'm going to talk about now is called the metabolic syndrome. Now, many people may have what we call the metabolic syndrome, and then they don't know it. The metabolic syndrome occurs when you have 3 out of 5 of risk factors for cardiovascular disease. And that includes having a large waist measurement. So we talked about women should have a waist measurement of 35, and men should have a waist measurement of 40. So if you're a woman and your waist measurement is greater than 35, well, that's one risk factor for metabolic syndrome. If you're a man and your waist measurement is greater than 40, that's one risk factor for metabolic syndrome. High triglyceride levels. So we talked earlier about the triglyceride level being greater than 150 is high. If it's less than 150, that's where we want to keep it. But if you have a triglyceride level then greater than 150, well, that's another risk factor for metabolic syndrome. If your HDL level, the healthy cholesterol level, is low, meaning that it's less than 40 milligrams per deciliter, that's another risk factor for metabolic syndrome. And if you have blood pressure greater than 130 over 85, if your blood pressure is greater than 130 over 85, that's another risk factor for metabolic syndrome. And then lastly, if your blood glucose is higher than 100 milligrams per deciliter, which is pre-diabetes, we're going to talk about diabetes in the next section. Between 100 and 125 is pre-diabetes. But if you have greater than 100 milligrams per deciliter, greater than 100, then that's another risk factor for metabolic syndrome. And if you have 3 of 5 of these, and I can look at them now and I can actually tell you that, fortunately, I don't have 3 of 5, but I do have one of, I know I have a large waist measurement, right? I know my waist measurement is greater than 40. My triglycerides, they tend to run lower. And then also my HDL tends to run in a good range. My blood pressure, because I do take a medication, has been lower. And then my fasting glucose tends to be lower as well. But if you have 3 out of 5, you don't have to have all 5, but if you have 3 of the 5, then that means you have metabolic syndrome. And having metabolic syndrome means that you're now at an increased risk of getting cardiovascular disease. So we need to educate our community members about what metabolic syndrome is, and we need to educate them about steps they can take to reduce these risk factors. Exercising to get a lower waist measurement and eating healthy, making sure that your triglyceride levels stay in a desirable or lower range, making sure our HDL levels stay higher. And then these types of things, keeping our blood pressure less than 130 over 85 and keeping our blood sugar less than 100 milligrams per deciliter are all actions that we can take to make sure that we're lowering our risk factors, particularly if we have metabolic syndrome. So as I mentioned, and I'm just going to go over it one more time because it's very important, metabolic syndrome is having 3 out of 5 of these risk factors. A large waistline, as I mentioned, for women is greater than 35 inches. For men, is greater than 40 inches. A triglyceride level of 150 milligrams per deciliter or more is a risk factor for metabolic syndrome. A low HDL level, cholesterol level. So less than 50 milligrams per deciliter for women, less than 40 milligrams per deciliter for men. We want to keep our HDL higher. We want to make sure that that's high. So we want to stay above 40. A blood pressure of 135 over 85 or higher and then a blood sugar greater than 100 milligrams per deciliter, which is actually pre-diabetes, but it is one of the risk factors in metabolic syndrome. So metabolic syndrome in your health, people with metabolic syndrome should try to eat a heart-healthy diet, lose weight, manage stress, quit smoking, and be more physically active. If these changes aren't enough, then you might need to talk to your doctor about starting medication. If you have a blood sugar greater than 100 milligrams per deciliter, you may need to talk to your doctor about diabetes medication. We're going to talk about that later. If your blood pressure runs higher than 130/85, you may need to talk to your doctor about bringing it down, particularly if you have metabolic syndrome, because all of these are risk factors for cardiovascular disease are putting you at risk. If you think you might have metabolic syndrome, talk to your healthcare provider. A physical exam and blood test can help to diagnose whether you have metabolic syndrome. Now, I showed you, and this is in your manual, about how to create an artery. As I mentioned earlier, so this is the toilet paper roll. You can use toilet paper roll. You can also use paper towel roll. I have some red felt here, but you can also use red construction paper, and then you can make a artery using those items as I did earlier. I now have my artery, and then I can have the waxy substance build up in my artery, making an indication for cholesterol. So you can see there how I have this Play-Doh, this Play-Doh that I can put into my tube here. And what that's going to do is that's going to obstruct blood flow. So now my red blood cell can't flow freely through my artery here. And that's what's going to cause my artery to be blocked. And I encourage you to make these items for demonstration in your community. When your LDL cholesterol is high, cholesterol and other substances can form a plaque-like substance in your artery, and this can then block blood flow. This blood flow is then what's going to lead to you having issues with cardiovascular disease. Okay, now going back to my slides then. So we're going to talk about now types of fat. And so as we talk about fat, and we're going to talk about reading the food labels in just a few minutes, but you heard me talk quite a bit about saturated fats. Saturated fats are very bad for you, and we want to make sure that we're educating our community about the importance of lowering our intake of saturated fats. But there are also other types of fats, and one of the other types of fats that's good for us is unsaturated fats. And so I don't want you to go out and eat a lot of unsaturated fats. You still want to avoid fats, but eating unsaturated fats is much healthier for you, much better for you than eating foods that are high in saturated fats. Unsaturated fats are better for you. They're healthier for you than the saturated fats. So we want to maybe look for those foods that are higher in unsaturated fats and lower in saturated fats. In addition, there is another one called trans fats. Now, with trans fats, if you see that in your foods, you want to run. You want to try to avoid at all costs eating foods that are high in trans fats. Now, unfortunately, it's a part of life that, hey, we do end up eating foods that are high in trans fats, but we want to make sure that we're reading our food labels, we're being diligent, and then, as I mentioned earlier, if you have those risk factors already, and particularly if you have metabolic syndrome, you want to look at strategies to eat less saturated fats, eat more unsaturated fats, and then avoid trans fats. So today we'll talk about the different types of fats and how they can affect your health. There are two main types of fats. So usually when you see your food label, you're going to see saturated fats and unsaturated fats. So saturated fats and unsaturated fats are the ones we're most commonly talk about. Most foods contain some of both types. The total fat amount found in food is both the unsaturated plus the saturated. That's going to be your total fat in the food. Saturated fat is found in foods that come from animals, such as high-fat meats, cheeses, milk, and butter. A type of unsaturated fat, so trans fat is a type of unsaturated fat, but it's very bad for you. Okay, so we want to avoid trans fats, but it's a type of unsaturated fat called trans fats can also raise your cholesterol level. Trans fat is usually found in a variety of baked goods, such as cookies, pies, and pastries. As I mentioned, hey, I love donuts, right? But donuts are going to be high in that trans fats, so we need to try to avoid them. You can also find them in fried foods, stick margarine, and vegetable shortenings. Choose light margarine or soft tub margarine instead of stick or hard margarine, and look for foods that are lower in trans fat, so trans fat-free spreads. Eating too much saturated fats and trans fats will raise your blood cholesterol levels more than anything else you can eat. So if you're eating foods that are high in saturated fats, we said those saturated fats are in animal products. If you're eating that bacon, that's going to be high in saturated fats. If you're eating those pork chops, that's going to be high in saturated fats. Make sure you read your food labels. Or if you're eating foods high in trans fats, that's going to really have an impact on your blood cholesterol level. Raising your LDL level, which is the lousy one, and then lowering your HDL level, putting you at risk of developing heart disease. So fats and how we cook them, right? Now, all of us, we use different things to cook. We probably got in the habit of, if you're we're similar to me, cooking with lard or cooking with animal fat, those are things that are going to put us at risk of cardiovascular disease. So what we need to do is we need to start choosing those cooking oils that are lower in saturated fats and that might be higher in unsaturated fats. So we need to eat some of the foods that are healthier for us. Fat has substances that your body can't make on its own and live without. So fat in general is good for us. We need fat in order to make some of the things that our body needs. These include things like helping us to absorb vitamin A, D, E, and K, but we can look for the healthier fats to take. Fats with some of the highest amounts of saturated fat include coconut oil, palm kernel oil, butter, beef fat, palm oil, pork fat, or lard. So when I say lard, like you see that lard in the can, that's pork fat, or shortening. These are all going to be bad fats that are higher in saturated fats, and we want to avoid them. Now, what you will notice is that saturated fats, if we were at room temperature and we had, let's say that that lard sitting at room temperature, it's solid, right? If it's solid at room temperature, chances are it's higher in the saturated fats. So saturated fats are usually going to be solid at room temperature. It's like if you were to cook some bacon in a pan and then you walk away, and if you come back, you will notice that that pan, the fat in it that was in it, it might have been liquid when you were cooking, but it had hardened up. So at room temperature, that lard is going to be hard. And that's the indication that it's higher in saturated fats. We also know, as I just mentioned, that saturated fats are usually found in animal products. And so usually when we cook, we want to avoid using those products that are high in saturated fat. But we also want to look at the foods that might be higher in saturated fat. So we know that whole milk and full fat dairy products such as regular cheese, sour cream, evaporated whole milk, all of these are going to be higher in saturated fats. We want to try to avoid them. Use low-fat milk instead, right? Or skim milk. Use low-fat cheese. Those are going to be better products for you. Ice cream and whipped cream are going to be high in saturated fat. Fatty cuts of meat. So when it was asked before about, hey, well, what about pork chops? Well, what about pork? Well, not all pork is bad for you. If you have like a pork tenderloin or a better cut of pork that doesn't have a lot of fat in it, that could be good to substitute. But if you're looking at those higher fat meats, such as the chuck steaks or regular ground beef, ribs, pork chops, bacon, pork sausage, all of that is going to be higher in your saturated fats. Hot dogs are going to be higher in saturated fats, both your beef and your pork hot dogs. Foods that are fried in grease, such as fried chicken or fried fish or fried shrimp, they're going to be higher in saturated fat. Butter, shortening, lard, and you can see here the other items that are going to be higher in saturated fats. And then if we get down here to some of these, like the donuts and the pastries, we also remember that they also have trans fats. So we want to make sure that we're avoiding those things. Now, we want to try to choose foods that are lower in saturated fats and higher in unsaturated fat. And that might mean looking at more like your lean meat, such as your loins, your rounds, and your extra lean ground beef, fish and seafood. That's going to be lower in saturated fat and higher in unsaturated fat. So your salmon, for example, salmon is going to have quite a bit of that unsaturated fat that is healthier for us. So we want to look at fish and seafood. Turkey bacon, that's going to be much lower than beef or pork bacon. Poultry without the skin. So it's okay to have chicken, but we might want to remove the skin from it, or we want to look at those healthier portions of the chicken. Beans, rice, tub margarine, all of these are going to be lower in saturated fats. And we want to make sure that we're using foods that are fat-free or low-fat milk, cheese, yogurt, and so forth. And then looking at vegetable oil. We know that vegetable oil is going to be a better choice than the lard for cooking in. Unsaturated fats are usually liquid at room temperatures, right? So if you have that olive oil in your closet, in your pantry, that's an unsaturated fat. That olive oil isn't going to freeze up like that bacon grease, right? Or like that lard. It's not going to become stiff and solid like the lard did or like the beef fat does. So we want to make sure that that's going to be an indication that, hey, vegetable oil, for example, at room temperature, it stays a liquid, right? Olive oil at room temperature stays a liquid. And so we want to make sure that we're looking at foods that are higher in unsaturated fats. They'll be liquid at room temperature, and then avoiding those foods that are higher in saturated fat. Replacing saturated fat with polyunsaturated or monounsaturated fats may reduce your risk of having a heart attack. The evidence is particularly strong for polyunsaturated oils, and here are some of the foods. So vegetable oil, cottonseed oil, corn oil, soybean oil. I said earlier, olive oil. And then also foods that are higher in monounsaturated fats. And those can include things like avocados, vegetable oils, olive oils, peanut oil. We want to make sure we're using that instead of using those ones that are in that are higher in saturated fats. Now, how do we know which one we should choose? Well, we want to read our food labels, right? Read our food labels. And this is an example of one of the food labels. And if you can see here, and I know it's difficult to see on this, but we'll switch over in a few minutes to a food label activity. But this here is going to be higher in unsaturated fat because it's an oil, and lower in saturated fat. So we want to choose this over the margarine, right? Because this margarine here, or this lard, I meant to say, I'm sorry, not margarine. This lard here is going to be higher in saturated fat and lower in unsaturated fat. So we can read our food labels, and that can help us to pick the right items. Give me just 1 second. Okay, so now going back to my slides, and on this page here, this gives you a list of where certain items are. And when I was talking to the team at Mayo Clinic, they said they have something that they can give out. But we can see, like looking at this, so the further we go down on this chart, the more saturated fat it's going to have. The higher up it is, the more unsaturated fat it has, right? So your canola oil, that's what we want to use. It only has 7% of your 7% of its fat. Safflower oil is 10%. Sunflower is 12%. And as we go down, we can see that we're going to get higher. And so then when you start looking at some of these, chicken fat is 30%. Lard is 43%. And these are very high in saturated fat. You know, you have 27% saturated fat, 43% saturated fat, 48% saturated fat. And I want to bring your attention to one thing, because, you know, you might hear, oh, coconuts, hey, it grows on trees. It's healthy for us. It's natural. But actually, coconut oil is very high in saturated fats. So we want to make sure we're avoiding cooking in coconut oil, cooking with coconut milk, because it's going to be very high in saturated fats. And that saturated fat is going to put us at risk of having high LDL cholesterol. It's going to put us at risk of having those plaque formations in our arteries. So we want to try to avoid those foods that are lower on this chart and use those cooking oils that are higher on this chart. If you have high cholesterol, you want to take action to prevent, to lower your cholesterol levels, particularly that LDL cholesterol levels. And look at, so one of the things we're going to encourage you to do is when you're shopping, read your food labels, right? You want to buy fat-free or low-fat milk, cheese, or other products. You want to look for those leaner cuts of meat, such as in beef and lean ground beef and those products. You want to try to buy canola, sunflower oil, and others instead of lard, right? You want to use your food labels to help you choose foods that are lower in saturated fat when cooking, right? You want to trim the fat off the meat, right? Don't cook with all that fat still hanging on the meat. I know it tastes better, but you want to cut that away so that you're not cooking in all that fat. You want to try to choose meats that are lower in saturated fat, and that includes like chicken and turkey. You want to try to use vegetable oil or baking pans instead of using the skillet to fry foods. You want to try to cook your meat, ground meat, thoroughly and drain the fat off before serving it or before adding to it. So usually I'll cook the ground beef first. I'll pour off the fat, and then before I add my other contents, because I don't want to eat all that fat. You want to have soups or stews. You want to skim that fat layer off before adding your vegetables in. When eating, you want to use you want fat-free or low-fat salad dressing. You want to choose fruits and vegetables instead of chips or high-fat foods. And then you want to look at what you can substitute in different areas. So for your breakfast, use fat-free or low-fat milk. For your lunch, look for roasted turkey and a sandwich. And for dinner, maybe including more fish. So these are all activities that we want to do and have for our community members. As I mentioned, and one thing I want to point out is that, you know, in your manual on page 5.34, you have here that list of choosing foods that are lower in saturated fats, and it has here canola oil, safflower oil, sunflower oil, corn oil, olive oil. These are the items you want to use. You want to avoid those items that are higher in saturated fat, which include coconut oil, right? I mean, you don't let the media tell you wrong and say, hey, cooking coconut oil is healthy for you. Well, coconut oil is going to be higher in saturated fats. You want to try to avoid that. Avoid using butter and beef fat, palm oil, and lard, as I mentioned earlier. And then lastly, so we want to move now to our food label activities. We covered food label activities in our hypertension section around looking at the sodium or salt content of a food. We can also read our food labels to give us information about the fat content and the saturated fat. So our food label will tell us a lot. As we mentioned before, it's going to first have your serving size and number of serving in the container. So this is a portion of whole milk. And in this container is 2 serving sizes, right? So one serving size will just be 1 cup, but this container has 2 cups. So as we read our food labels, if we consume the whole container, right? Now, I don't know what this container looks like. Might be like a 16-ounce bottle. But if we're consuming the whole container, that means we have to multiply everything on the food label then by 2, right? So it's going to only have 150 calories per serving, but this container has 2 servings. So it actually has 300 calories, right? One serving size, though, is 1 cup. So if I have the container and I pour out 1 cup, I'm consuming 1 a container, then I can go back to, hey, it's 1 serving size. But if I consume the whole container, I'm assuming this is a 16 ounce, well, 8 ounces is a cup. I'm assuming this is a 16-ounce container. It has 2 serving sizes. So if I consume the whole serving size, I have to multiply everything by 2, right? It's going to tell you your amount per serving. So here with the saturated fat, right, we can see that this container contains, per serving is 4.5 grams of fat. That's 23% of our percent daily value. And we talked about percent daily value before. It's like having a budget. If you have $100 in your budget, well, if I consume 1 cup, that's 23% of my percent daily value. If I consume the whole container, 45% of my percent daily value. So the amount of saturated fat I should take in a day, I've already consumed more than half of the amount I should take in a day with this 1 container of whole milk. So we have to keep in mind that we're looking at our food labels. Tell your community members to read the food labels and look at the amount of saturated fat. And then make sure that as we went over, and we'll go over some of the other items. So we were talking about sodium earlier. 1 serving size will have 105 milligrams of sodium. If we drink the whole container, then we're getting up to 210 milligrams of sodium. That's still less than the 20%. Remember, I told you earlier, when we're looking at our food label percent daily values, we want to stay less than 20%. That's good. But with our fat, we're higher than 20%. So we want to make sure we take that into account. Now, moving along, we want to look at food label activities involving the saturated fat. So which one is a better choice? Except for calories and saturated fat, fat-free milk has all of the same nutrients as whole milk. So drinking fat-free milk, the only thing you're losing with fat-free milk, and some people are going to argue the taste, it might not taste as good, but fat-free milk has everything in it except for the calories and the saturated fats. Those saturated fats have been removed from the milk, and that's where we get our fat-free milk from. Everything else is going to be the same, so it still has the same amount of calcium in it. But reading our food labels can help us to choose the right products to keep our hearts strong, right? Calcium fortified alternatives such as soy milk also exist. Soy milk, there's also oat milk now. There are other types of milk as well. However, they may not have all of the other nutrients found in milk. But looking at our food label, so we have the choice between whole milk, which is going to have 4.5 grams of saturated fat per serving, versus our fat-free milk, which only has 0.1 grams of saturated fat. So clearly, the best choice here is our fat-free milk. The saturated fat has been taken out of the fat-free milk. So by reading our food labels, we can see that fat-free milk is the better choice. Now, going through some food label activities, and I want you to do this with your community members, we can help Pam choose the better breakfast. We have honey buns, and honey buns we saw before. So 1 serving is 1 honey bun, whereas we have a plain bagel. Now, earlier, we did talk about the other components, right? We talked about sodium, and we can see here that, yes, the plain bagel is going to be higher in sodium than the honey bun. But here, we're talking about saturated fat. And so when it comes to the saturated fat, this honey bun has 10.9 grams of saturated fat, whereas the bagel has 0.3 grams of 0.3 grams of saturated fat. So when it comes to saturated fat, our better choice is going to be the bagel, right? We still have to keep an eye on salt. And of course, this plain bagel is going to be higher in salt. But when we're looking at our fat, and that's what we're taking into account here, our bagel is the better choice to avoid saturated fat. Our jelly donut versus our honey bun, once again, we can see that our jelly donut has 4 grams of fat. That's 20% of our percent daily value, whereas our English muffin only has 0.4 grams of saturated fat. So from a standpoint of saturated fat, our English muffin is the better choice. We can see banana muffin versus a banana. The banana muffin has 3.4 grams of saturated fat. That's 17%. It's not that 20%, but it's still a better choice is eating the banana, right? We can see that the banana only has 0.1 gram of saturated fat. Butter versus light or tub margarine. So this is the question that's often asked. Well, which one is better for me? Is it better to have butter or is it better to have tub margarine? And what will we tell our community members? We tell our community members to read the food label. Read your food label. And by reading the food label, we can see that the fat has 7 grams of saturated fat, whereas the tub margarine only has 1.2. So from a saturated fat standpoint, we're much better with our tub margarine than we are with butter. We can move on, and I'm not going to go through all of these, but earlier I was talking about cheese, and I would love for you to do the demonstration where you demonstrate that, hey, one piece of cheese, 1 ounce, piece of cheese has 3.8 grams of fat. Okay, 1 piece of American cheese has 3.8 grams of fat, right? Our better choice is going to be that low-fat American cheese. It's reduced. It's taken down some. We still have 2.5 grams of saturated fat, but we're getting in a situation where we're taking in less saturated fat. So we want to make sure that we talk to our community members about those food label activities. As I mentioned earlier, and I do encourage you to do this if you can, to get a 2-ounce piece of cheese, maybe just a little bit, 2 tablespoons of mayonnaise, 2 pieces of chicken. It can be a wing and a thigh, a beef hot dog, cooked beans. And then you can ask your community members to guess the fat. Guess how much fat is in each of these items. And it gives you the amounts at the beginning of the session. So before you start your session, I encourage you to, we go to the front, and I know I'm scrolling through this fast, but on page 5.3, it gives you what it is in terms of teaspoons. So for that American cheese, you demonstrate that, hey, that American cheese has 3 1/4 teaspoon of saturated fat in it. So that lard, you can take lard and you can put it on the plate. Take 3 teaspoons and 1/4 teaspoon and put it on a plate and show your community members how much fat they're getting with each of these items. The mayonnaise, the American cheese, the hot dogs. That would be a good way to demonstrate the amount of saturated fat that's in foods that we commonly eat. So I encourage you to do that activity. Now, this is in your manual. You can ask them to guess the amount of fat, right? We talked about American cheese having 3 1/4. We talked about 2 tablespoons of regular mayonnaise having like 5 teaspoons of fat. And so putting that on the a plate, and keep in mind that you want a plate that's not white, because your lard is going to be white. It will be hard for them to see it. So get a colored paper plate and then put the lard on these items. So just quickly, how can we avoid the saturated fat? We want to cook with less saturated fat. So in your manual are recipes for cooking less saturated fat, so you can go over these recipes. You want to look at, so when the recipe calls for certain things, you can always substitute. So instead of 1 whole egg, you can use 2 egg whites, right? Instead of a cup of butter, you can use a cup of soft tub margarine, or you can use 2/3 cup of vegetable oil. If it calls for lard, well, you can use tub margarine or vegetable oil again. If it calls for whole milk, substitute that with fat-free milk. If it calls for a cup of cream, well, instead of doing that, you can use evaporated fat-free milk. So there's always substitutions that we can make, and then looking for those fat-free items. And then in the manual, it does give you a soul food recipe that I encourage you to use with your community members. So that is the session on keeping your cholesterol in check. Thank you so much for joining today, and I look forward to seeing you on the next training. Thank you.